couple of months ago, I gave a talk at the Awwwards conference. I explained why most 3D websites suck, and we also got our hands dirty with an interactive demo where we took a really basic 3JS project and we made it into an amazing 3D experience. Before we start, let me introduce myself. My name is Xavier. Some people also call me Jack. You can find me on Twitter. My username is KMKOTA0. I love to do 3D stuff, and I've been doing so for clients for the last 8 years of my life. I worked for really big brands like HBO, Adidas, Spotify, Bottega Veneta, Vogue, and many, many more. On my free time, I also love to do experiments, and when I'm not working for clients, I have a lot more room to explore different things. For example, I did some experiments doing real-time cam tracking using the webcam. I also do tooling for 3JS, and in general, I love to do demos with a lot of interactivity, rigging, parametric animations, and many more things. Let's get started by talking about some concepts. First, I want to talk about the web. I remember being a kid in a small city close to Barcelona, and I would get pretty bored from the reality around me. And I used to love the idea of getting into the internet and this window to the world. I also see the web as a white canvas where anyone can create anything and share it to the rest of humanity. Creativity is not just about creating something, but about creating something interesting. Anybody can draw some shapes on a piece of paper, but not many people can do it like Joan Miró. When I say that most 3D websites suck, I mean that they suck from a creative point of view. They're bad about getting attention, about generating a feeling, about being memorable. So bear in mind that my approach to creating 3D websites and my opinions are from this point of view, not from a usability point of view or from a productivity one. Technology has improved a lot in recent years. Mainstream computers have great GPUs and everyone has access to amazing tools. For example, Blender, which is free and has a lot of functionality, and 3JS has improved a lot also. So it's easier than ever to create 3D websites. But creating great things, it's not about the tools, it's about craft. Craft is the difference between getting things done and getting things done well. Craft is about repeating the same task over and over again. It's about solving the same problem in different ways. It's about creating a toolkit of techniques. Above all, craft is about gaining an intuition so we can create with expressivity. Most people getting into 3D websites are coming either from doing front-end development or advertising. I personally came from front-end development. So let's talk about front-end for a second. When creating websites or apps, most of the times we want them to be fast, reliable, usable, and accessible. When creating websites, the most normal thing to do is to think in pages or screens. Each page or screen represents a state, which is a moment in time. State can be represented in a declarative way using markup language or a scene graph. People coming from advertising are used to create images. And when creating 3D images for advertising, they usually use 3D software like Cinema 4D. This type of software uses ray-traced renderers, which are not suitable for real-time graphics. These type of renderers are great at generating photorealistic images. In those, they can use really detailed models, really high-quality textures. They can do amazing lighting and crazy materials. People in advertising are also used to work in video format. When working with video, there's a clear timeline, which allows for linear storylines. The reason why most 3D websites suck is because they try to replicate the output of these disciplines. And it's not going to be possible. The true strength of real-time graphics is interaction. In an interactive website, the user can control the content and get feedback from the website. The user can connect at a new level, and we should embrace it. Interactive, it's not a picture. It's not a series of states. And it's not a timeline. It's more like a living organism that never stops. Any states can be changed at any time, all the animations can be interrupted, and basically anything can happen at any time. Interactive is a mix of declarative and imperative. Let's talk about interaction for a second. In interaction, we have an input and we have a feedback. The most common input is click. And the click is alright, we can trigger something at a position on the screen. But there's much more powerful interactions, like dragging. When dragging, the user can decide where does the interaction start, how does it move, how long does it take, where does it end. It's much more expressive. Let's talk for a sec about feedback. It could be something that we see on the screen, or it could be a sound. Here's a cool technique that I like to use. Sometimes I like to give a variable reward, so the user doesn't know what's going to be the feedback. A simple example would be a slot machine, but it can be applied in much more subtle ways. A discipline that sometimes gets a bit ignored when creating 3D websites is game design, and in fact, I think it's the most similar. In game design, there's this concept which is game feel. And game feel is the intangible, tactile sensation experienced when interacting with video games. Check out this clip.
In Mario 64, the plumber is such a fun avatar to control with his bouncy jump, his wall kicks, his triple leaps, his long jumps and his stomach dives that you could lose hours just hopping around a blank room. The game feel here is about the friction and momentum and weight of Mario, and it's the most important thing. In fact, the level design and enemies in Mario 64 exist simply to facilitate Mario. The levels let players express his movement and challenge them to master his underlying moveset.
And finally, before we get into the demo, I want to talk about one last concept. Something I realized when working with Simon, a creative director for Resin, is that he would always start with an interaction at the very beginning of the project. He would make a prototype and he would even use it for pitching to the client. After working with him in several projects, I realized that this first interaction that we would prototype ended up being the most memorable one. At my practice, I always start a project thinking about the main key interaction. I do a prototype in really low fidelity where I remove all the materials and all the aesthetic details. This way, I can focus in that main interaction, making sure that it feels great. All right, enough theory, demo time. All right, so here you can see the demo. You can access it in your browser going to spgi01b.excel.digital. I recommend that you visit the website because when talking about interaction, there's nothing like feeling it for yourself. So in this first step, we have a basic configurator. We load the GLTF model using the GLTF loader from Three.js. We use an environment map for lighting. We use mesh standard material also from Three.js. This is like a built-in material. We have this basic UI that changes the color of the material. We use Three.js orbit controls so we can look around. And we use post-processing and ambient occlusion. In this second step, we add some environment to the scene. Because if we're doing a 3D scene, why would we do something so flat? We want the user to feel immersed in the experience. So here I created this kind of garage-looking situation. Next step, camera offset. So instead of using the orbit controls from Three.js, here we used one of the most common techniques when doing 3D experiences. We have a fixed camera that provides a nice layout, so we always see the environment from a nice point of view. And we move the camera a tiny bit to the sides using the mouse position. This way, the user doesn't need to make a conscious interaction. Just by moving the mouse, which he or she is going to do anyway, they see that they're in a 3D environment. Also, I want to take this moment to talk about a really important thing. When creating interactive 3D websites, we want them to feel nice. And when we want them to feel nice, usually we don't want to take the raw input values from the mouse. We want to smooth them. So check this out. Here, I'm using the mouse raw values. As you can see, it feels really, really rough. But when we use a smoothing function, it feels much, much better. These details are really, really important. And this example, it's one of the most basic ones. In the next step, we're going to let the user interact with the objects on the scene because it's kind of nice to let the user move the camera using orbit controls. But if you think about it, if we move the camera, it's mostly like if we're looking around, but we're not really interacting with the scene. But if we let the user move something in the scene, this connection is going to be much, much stronger. So here we added a platform that we can rotate. And now all of a sudden, there's much more of a connection. So when coding this type of interactions, a good thing to do is to mimic the physical world. This is something that Apple does amazingly. For example, here I'm using a spring and inertia. I'm going to disable both right now and let's see how it feels. Again, it feels really rough. Spring, it's similar to the smoothing function that we used in the previous step. So it's going to make the dragging much, much nicer. But check this out, when we let go, it stops really fast. In the real world, if we would throw something, it would keep moving and it would slowly stop. This is because of inertia. We can replicate this in code. So look at this. Now, when I let go, it keeps rotating and it feels much better. In this step, I'm using a technique called wiggle bones. Let's see what happens. Look at this. So what we did here is we rigged the 3D model. You can see here a representation of the bones. If you don't know what rigging is, it's basically adding some bones, which are points on space. And then when these points are moved, the mesh moves with it. Wiggle bones is a technique that we use with the rig, so we can do parametric animations. So only by moving the root bone, everything else moves softly and it feels alive. Here we're rotating the root bone with the mouse and everything else follows. Also, we can rotate and all of a sudden we have a much more engaging experience. In this next step, we're going to add some playful UI. If you remember the first part of the video, I was talking about variable rewards. I changed the UI to one that doesn't really show the colors. We can throw this UI, we don't know where it's going to stop, and we don't know what color is going to be chosen. Let's talk now about VFX. VFX are usually special shaders and particles, and they're basically animation candy. They make things feel much, much better. Here what I did is I added an holographic shader, and I added some particles to get to this kind of glitchy effect. Let's see it without the hologram so you can see what the particles are. They're these small squares that look like glitches. And now let's see the hologram. It's the same geometry, but with a different material that has a Fresnel and it's glowing and it just looks like a hologram. So now we got the motion and the interaction to feel really, really nice. And now it's the moment to go into more high fidelity. In this case, I added a new environment model featuring more details like cables and neon lights. I added textures and light maps. I also added some typographic elements that create a nice composition. And I used LUTs for cinematic grading. So this was the original coloring. And with the LUT, we get to this grading. I also added some animations for these typographic elements. And we keep all the old functionality. Last but not least, use the loader as an introduction to the experience. This lets the user land into the experience in a graceful way. In this case, we introduced some of the elements like the logo that it's going to be in the sleeve later, and we move the camera from farther to closer to get this impression that we're getting into the experience. So let's check this out again. We started with this really basic 3D viewer with a bit of configuration functionality, and we ended up with an amazing, immersive 3D experience. There's no predefined steps for interaction design. There's not like a handbook that I'm gonna give to you and you can apply it and make any experience one that feels nice. You need to practice, you need to learn your craft, and slowly you will gain that intuition that I was talking about. Also, I want to note that crafting 3D experiences is a creative process, and as most creative processes, it can be a painful process. I worked on this demo that I showed you maybe for over a month. I don't want to give the impression that creating something cool is something fast. I want to make sure that you know that I tried a lot of things that didn't make it to the demo, and also I had to tweak a lot of small things. If you want to get into making 3D experiences, I recommend that you start doing a lot of small experiments in low fidelity and focus on the interaction. Going high fidelity takes a lot of time. Make sure to go small and focus on what really matters. A tip for those with a bit more experience and doing client work is that we need to learn how to say no. Sometimes we will have clients that will come to us with this idea of creating a website that looks like an ad, and will come with references, with ray traced renders. We need to teach them that's not going to happen, or that they can use a video and attach it to the scroll. It's in our interest to teach them about the strengths of interactivity. And finally, my last tip is to have fun. I have this theory that if you have fun when you're creating something, that thing gets impregnated with that feeling, and that the people viewing it or experiencing it are going to feel it. Please have fun and enjoy the process. I'm running a crowdfunding campaign for my Wigglebones library. You can learn more at wiggle.excel.digital. It would mean a lot if you can support it and support me into creating cool things for the web. That's all. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a nice one.